That was a lot of information, perhaps new, perhaps not. The idea that the bodies of the vertebrae, so that's what I got confused with. I'm like, oh, if the bodies of the vertebrae are where my weight goes, then I guess my weight's right here, like in the center of it. And then it's in the center of the next one. And then that kept me with that idea of stacking. So just because it transmits the weight doesn't mean it transmits the weight straight through. It transmits the weight within that wave. Okay, now we're going to get up and go ahead and feel that, of course. So what we're going to aim to feel is the fact that the curves are changing naturally with movement. And the movement we're going to look at is the idea just of bending and straightening. So plie and stretch. Don't worry about being turned out. In fact, I'd say don't be turned out. So you don't have to worry about any of that. Okay, so go ahead and stand up. And let's put one hand on your lower back, so your lumbar, and one hand on your cervical. Okay, and don't think of anything in particular. Don't think of making anything happen. Just go ahead and bend and stretch a few times. Now, given the fact that you're all dancers, dance teachers, means you probably already have some cueing that naturally, instinctively takes over when you do this. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. I'm suggesting you don't turn out so that you don't go into like ballet brain or anything. Okay, just let yourself bend and stretch. Now, it took me a while to sort of notice and allow, give permission for what ideally is actually happening. Those curves are increasing. So if you were to measure me from head to tail on straight legs, I'm a little bit taller in this line than when I'm on a plie, because on a plie, I'm absorbing shock. If you think about why the body would be wanting to bend, it would be because maybe I'm landing a jump or something. So there's going to be impact, or even I'm walking, or I'm jogging, or I'm running, whatever. So the bending of the legs tells your body, hey, there's impact that's associated with this. So there's a force absorption. So as I'm doing this, all curves are changing, but these ones tend to be the ones that are easiest to feel. When I'm taking my bend, see if you can notice in the cervical and lumbar that there's an increase, a deepening of the curves, and then a lengthening of the curves. A deepening of the curves, and a lengthening of the curves. It will be subtle, but it's important. Okay, that deepening of the curve and lengthening of the curve. Now, I'm not talking about the fact that there's a student who's going to suddenly go, whoo, and stick their tail out. But that's often why they do it. That's a whole, song and dance unto itself right now. But right now, let's just say it doesn't necessarily mean the naked eye sees it. In fact, when you do it so much like that, it's because something else isn't happening and it's not being distributed subtly through the whole system. Likely because it's not happening in the pelvis, which will, again, that's pelvis is next to it. Okay, so I'm deepening the curves and lengthening curves. Notice I'm saying lengthening the curves, not eliminating or flattening. Deepening and lengthening. Deepening and lengthening. Now, how's that going for you? Able to feel that? And notice that it happens just a little bit? Now, it took me a bit of time because I had such a habit, a muscular habit of preventing that from happening. So one of the best things you can do now is you go, if I'm not sure, and you're going, well, she seems to talk a good game, but I don't know if I really believe her on this, then do the opposite. Okay, so just get up and try the opposite. So if this was deepening and lengthening, now let's do the opposite. Let's lengthen our curves when we go down and deepen them when you come up. And see how that feels. Lengthen them when you go down and deepen them when you come up. Now, ironically, that's what a lot of people do. A lot of dancers do that. They let their tail hang so much that it lengthens stuff out. But if you're noticing, you'll even notice that almost tail tuck puts pressure to the sides of the knees. Okay, so if I lengthen and then deepen it, it's kind of like I compress back down. And this does not have shock absorption. It's the opposite. I didn't let my curve increase with the shock, getting the stretch energy ready to also take me off. The other really cool thing, right, I think anyway, is when I'm increasing those curves, so again, think of that stretch going back, increasing the curve. This energy here is what actually creates me coming up. So if I do let that stretch happen, then all those little muscles are ready for me to come up. Okay, so the truth is, you do lengthen your spine, but you don't do it voluntarily. You don't do it on purpose. You do it as a response to having let the curves deepen for their force absorption. So that's the big for me is I think a lot of teachers, maybe great dancers who became teachers but weren't really teachers first, if they really let their body move appropriately, they're feeling that lengthening. They're noticing it because it feels light and it feels good. So they communicate that and say, well, let your spine feel light and lengthen that spine. But they're only sharing what they feel, but they were perhaps, because it's natural, unaware of the cause. So they were communicating the effect, not the cause. And I think that's where we get into trouble. So I know that I heard lengthen your spine for decades. I also know that I had the chiropractors I shared earlier telling me about my 7th cervical of myself and all my students because I've been over flattening. Okay. I also know that I go, do I just seriously have to get even stronger and stronger and stronger? Or maybe something was a little off compared to somebody who let that happen. And I got more tired. I didn't jump as high. And you're looking, you go, why? And maybe it's because I took, as a good A+ student, I took the lengthen your spine and kept it all the time and did it full on all the time. And I got into a polarity. So if you think of something dynamic and alive, like all your tissues, and I just do this all the time, how elastic is that? It's not very dynamic at all. In fact, I'm like trying to headbutt it to maybe make it move. It barely moves. And I thought it was strength. It wasn't, it was tension. Okay. Now, young people are, especially those keeners, they're really wanting to please you. And if they don't yet know how to calibrate the difference between feeling strong and feeling tense, I do think that's our responsibility. And for me, I would err on the side of missing out on a few strengthening moments, but avoiding at all costs tension, because tension is going to mask the sensation. They will slowly and surely be having tension creeping in and having them less able each year to feel and take ownership of their own body. So that somatics idea of really being able to feel, you're disempowering them if you're doing anything that allows tension to creep in. And we could talk about the payoff of that, like when you're 35, what's it been like to be in a tense body your whole life? Not very emotionally healthy either, right? Okay, so avoiding tension means we have to maybe re-look at what our strength is. What are we planning with strength? And I think there's strength to developing a muscle. Yeah, but strength, when we talk about posture, that's what I'd like to use the rest of today about, is understanding dynamic posture instead of strong, which often becomes held, which actually throws off the whole system. So now, just to prove that to yourself even more, go ahead and let's do the correct deepen and lengthen. Okay, and do just even light jumps. I'm not seeing your feet. Don't care if you point your feet. Just do a few light jumps. Keeping your hands there and see if you can feel that I'm allowing. In fact, start to put them in sequence so that it's actually like that ball bouncing. And think of a ball bouncing, right? It goes squish, release, squish, release, squish and release, squish and release. A natural flow. Okay, I don't get my natural flow if I jump, stay, and then magically, just use my power to come up again. I get my bounce when I go down and automatically rebound. Okay, so this is a little bit about timing. Am I going to keep my timing happening? And one thing that I find fascinating is that when you bring back the deepen and lengthen naturally, you will also find you're way better. You can kind of like put your jumping timing on a dial and actually adjust. If my spine is stiff, and I'm going to get you to try that, but you only have to do like 2 or 3 because it'll feel gross. If I try to jump with my spine perfectly held, all that happened, there wasn't this absorption through the whole system. There was a gravity went, knees bend. Maybe I can slow down a bit in my thighs, maybe a bit in my feet, maybe. But what you'll find, these are the kids that jump and land and stop and stop. And they're just using their power to go every time. They get exhausted. You've done 16 changements and you're like, oh my God. Okay. And you're exhausted because you didn't use your rebound. And they also can't speed up. So they're not very good at slowing down and they're not very good at speeding up. They have like their sweet spot of jumping tempo. If you find that happening to yourself or others, it's probably because you are resisting resiliency in your spine. Okay. And as soon as I resist resiliency in my spine, meaning my curves are changing, I confuse the resiliency of my thigh muscles. I confuse the resiliency of my calf muscles and my feet. It's kind of, you know, like I dare you to try squeezing your butt and not squeeze your jaw. Like they tend to go together. Tension somewhere, shoot somewhere else. So if I've got great resiliency in my spine because I'm letting my curves express themselves, which does not mean they exist. That is not your curves expressing themselves. Your curves expressing themselves means they change. And that was the big one for me, where I went, oh, I have curves. I'm letting it be curved. Yay. Well, yeah. Are you letting the curves change when you move? And I wasn't. I was being a good girl and holding my posture really, really steady and lengthening my spine, not letting it change, and not being able to find the same rebound in the arch of the foot where it's going to go same thing. And then the way the muscles of the calf and the thighs work as well. Okay. So that's number one. Is let's just try 2 or 3 where you are holding your posture, which means you haven't let the curves do their job of either force absorption or return of energy, and feel what that feels like. You'll find you really have to do it in your feet. Yeah. So I feel like I'm jumping with my legs, and I only want to do a few because I know my point and it just feels so gross. But if I let my curves change, doesn't mean I've let go of my posture. It's now my whole body's jumping, and I'm probably jumping for joy too. And there's going to be a natural feeling there. You don't have to tell them to smile. Maybe it actually feels good. Okay, so that's number one. So, you know, this idea of lengthen the spine, you know, I've heard it thousands, tens of thousands. Gosh, it could be 100,000 times in my career. And I said it a lot too. I'm not going to say it anymore. I would just talk about resiliency and bounce and talk about the fact that it's going to change. And I would make sure that I am, let's say, correcting a student. So here's the piece too. We get caught up in this idea of what's good here must be good here. Well, I'd say a ball squishing down, force absorption is an entirely opposite concept to return of energy. So I've got my force absorption here, the squish, and then the return here. The squish being my curves increasing and then my curves lengthening. Okay, they're opposites. So if I'm correcting a student or giving a cue about how to have my posture on straight legs, you know that if you don't change and tell them also, by the way, it'll feel a little different when you plie, then they're going to keep it. So I think we need to be super careful about saying, okay, I'm going to maybe adjust posture, but I actually am going to put out to you now going, you know what, wouldn't it be interesting to adjust the posture in the plie where the pelvis can hang easier through those hips anyway, and let the lengthening of how the anatomy was designed to take place during the straightening, which is when it was designed. So I will not ask a student already on straight legs to lengthen. I will let them go into their bend, their plie, their fondu, and then say, as you go, do you feel the lengthening? Do you feel the natural up? And yes, they can, and they probably will. And you will need to be careful on those super, you know, straight A type students that they don't think that I now need to lengthen more. If some is good, more is better. We have that attitude a lot just in life, don't we? And you can talk to them about, like, I don't know, maybe adults, you can say, well, vitamins are like that, right? Do you really want to take all the vitamins of the ones that, you know, you become toxic in? Like, we have to have it, but it's the right amount. So it's sort of about dosage. And your body is brilliantly designed to do the right dosage. We don't need to overdose on purpose. Okay. And then that brings, of course, to another sort of confusion I just want to talk about briefly here is just the concept of the word stretch. I know when I think of the word stretch, I can think of I'm, stretching my feet, or I'm pulling something long. I'm stretching behind my knee, that type of thing. But I could also think of I'm stretching my muscles. Now, if I was to stretch my calf muscle, I'm actually bending my knee. So I think the word stretch is also something that puts a lot of confusion into the dancer's mind. Okay, so I could be holding a stretch in my muscles where I'm actually lessening my power, as I mentioned earlier. Or the type of stretch that would be really interesting to make it more part of how you talk about things would be, again, me and my little demonstration here, but the stretch energy. If we talked about, it's almost like there's three stretches: stretch your muscle, stretch out a joint, utilize and exploit almost stretch energy. And it's unfortunate that we tend to use the word stretch for those two, because then when we want to talk about the third one, it becomes like, what the heck is stretch energy? Okay. And as much as you can maybe say, I'm going to find the stretch energy by finding that nice little 6-8 for them to jump to or something like that. Again, if they only have a sweet spot for their jumping, chances are they're holding their spine. And what you found for them is the perfect just reaction of the legs, but not the whole body. If it's jumping with the whole body, you can do a whole bunch of different speeds. Okay, so let's clear up the idea of stretch. And that might be the sort of conversation you have with your students and go, you need to know there's 3 types of stretch. And maybe in your class, you come up with a fun word for something else. You might say, we're doing a joint opening. Open the joints of your foot. Maybe you might say that. Maybe you might say lengthen your hamstrings when you're doing a hamstring stretch. So you use the word lengthen. And then maybe stretch can be reserved for that idea of stretch energy. That's up to you to play with and talk with your students and go, I actually want to know what you're thinking here, because let's not be confused. The way our body works on this phase is opposite to this phase. They are opposites. Our bodies respond in opposition, as in movement. Okay. Now, along that idea is a little bit more, is of course talking about posture, good old posture. Okay.